This is the first of our demonstrations for processors, the CPU. Now, as you can tell on this motherboard, and this is the kit motherboard, the processor is already installed. The heatsink and the fan assembly has already been connected and it's already plugged into power. Now there's a reason for that. Obviously before I started my demos I wanted to put together the entire kit computer, make sure it works. And I've done so. But that also facilitates two things for you. First of all, you're going to see how to remove properly the heatsink fan assembly on all four of our motherboards, then how to remove the processor, and then we'll go back through the process of putting the processor into the socket as it belongs and applying new thermal compound. So you're going to see both the installation and the removal process, but you'll see the removal first for each one of the motherboards. This motherboard, as I said before, is the kit motherboard, and what it has on top of it is this large fan, heatsink you can see underneath the fins. Here's the power cord, goes down to the motherboard for power to the fan. The four corners of this fan assembly have an interesting mechanism on how to release it. So let's zoom in a little bit so we can get a little bit tighter on our fan assembly. Now we've zoomed in on the fan assembly on the heatsink, and there are four posts. One here, one over there, one down here, and the fourth one, as you might imagine, is over there. But we're looking at this in a two-dimensional fashion straight on. So what I'm going to do is gently rotate this around so we can see the third dimension of those four posts. Let's take a look at this one right here. We can now see that the post runs well down through the motherboard. And at the top of each of these posts, I believe you can see there's a little notch right there, where a flat blade screwdriver is going to go into the top of this little post, and you would turn it to lock it, and you would turn it to unlock it. Now, which way would you turn it? Well, you can't see it very well, but on the top of each one of these, there is a little teeny tiny arrow. And the arrow pointed in a counterclockwise would be to lock down the post. So on this post, with my flat blade, if I inserted it and went around in a counterclockwise fashion, it should lock it down. I'm now going to turn it back around straight on to you, use my flat blade, and loosen these by turning in a clockwise direction. Now this is plastic, so you don't really need to torque very hard or you will damage the little mechanism. Start with this one right here. Try this one down here. You might hear a very faint click. And then, pardon my getting in your way. Okay, now I've turned all of them a quarter turn in a clockwise fashion, which is opposite the arrow, so now it should be released. What I'm going to do is turn the motherboard around because I want to show you what's happening on the underside with the plastic lockdown mechanism. So let's go to the back side of this motherboard. This is the underside of my kit motherboard. Here's where one of those plastic posts has gone all the way through and locked down, and over here is another one. Now you may be able to tell from the picture that we have the two little white pieces of plastic on the left and the right, and in the center is a small little round piece of plastic. Same is true over here. But if you get to looking at this one over here, you can tell that that black piece of plastic is actually protruding through the motherboard just as far as the white pieces of plastic. That means it has not released. When I did that quarter turn, that black piece of plastic should have pulled back through the hole instead of being flush with the whites. This one is about halfway through, back through the hole as it should be. This one's not pulled back at all. I'm going to go back around to the front or the top of the motherboard again. Now this one right here, I believe is up as high as it needs to be. But if I put my finger under it and try to lift a little bit, you may have noticed it popped up just a little bit more. The same is true for all four. I'm going to hold the heatsink assembly in place, use my other hand, and assist that little tiny black piece of plastic to come up out of that hole as it should. There's that one. It's now raised a little higher, and again, I know this is two-dimensional, so you probably can't tell that it's raised, but it's about another 1/8 of an inch up. Now, if we turn it back around one more time, we don't need to, that little center piece of black plastic, that little round piece, has pulled back through the hole, and I can lift off the fan and heatsink assembly. Of course, I do need to connect it from the motherboard. So there's my connector. Let's turn this over and see what we got. This is the underside of my heatsink. I showed you in my presentation on the PowerPoint what it looked like when it came from the manufacturer with those 3 little gray splotches of thermal paste. Well, the reason why you see white thermal paste here is because I have done this a couple of times in practice before the video. When I move this out of the way, let's look at the top of the processor. And there it is. One thing I want you to notice about the processor is that thermal paste has not run down over the edges down onto the green circuit board below. That would be a bad thing. You want it to cover enough, but you definitely don't want it to run all over the sides. So what I'm going to do now is clean the underside of my heatsink. I'm just going to use a little bit of toilet paper to wipe off the excess that I have here. I'm going to do the same to the processor. If this was a real system that had been running anywhere from 3 to 5 months up to 24 to 36 months, this would not be nice and gooey as you see it here. It would be crusty, maybe even flaky. On one of my older systems, I had one that was genuinely flaky. You need to scrape that off, but for heaven's sakes, don't use something sharp like a knife or a razor blade or a Phillips screwdriver. What I used at home was just a plastic spoon. You know the standard type you take to picnics? Nice plastic, gentle rubbing, clean off all of the old thermal compound before you put on the new. So I'm going to set down the motherboard, spend a moment and use some toilet paper and clean off the underside of my heatsink and the processor, and then we'll pick up with the process of applying the thermal compound again. I have set the heatsink aside, cleaned the underside of it nice and clean, and it looks about like that. Isn't that beautiful? That's in anticipation of putting a little bit of thermal compound on the underside of that heatsink. And the other thing I did was I actually removed my processor out of this socket. But one of the things I want to show you, of course, is how to properly remove and install a processor into its socket. Now this happens to be an LGA or a land grid array. Specifically, it's the LGA 1155 for my kit motherboard. And what we're looking at is the socket with the processor in the socket, and it has been captured by this little frame that you see all around the socket. To take the processor out of this land grid array socket, this little bar right here is actually a spring-loaded bar. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my thumb right here on this round spot, and I'm going to push down slightly towards the motherboard and then away. In other words, I'm going to push in that direction so that the very end of this little bar that you see right there will actually come out from underneath this little hook. Down and away like that, and now it's going to come up. Now I'm almost vertical, so I've got to be kind of careful, because as this bar continues on up, it's going to bring that frame that I just identified, this whole little frame around the chip is also going to come up with it. See that? Now you can see how it actually anchors. This screw here on the motherboard is for that notch. And as I lock it down, it goes underneath. So let's go ahead and lift this all the way up. And there's my processor. Now I'm not quite at vertical, so it hasn't dropped out yet, but the fact of the matter is, it'll just fall out right in your hands. This is the 1155 land grid array socket, and this is the underside of the processor. There are no pins. It's just those gold contacts that fit into that socket. Now I'm going to set the processor down for just a moment because I want to point out something else that you probably can't see at all, but it's really important to know. Don't you hate it when he says that? Right there is a little tiny piece of plastic. Straight across from it right there is also a little tiny piece of plastic. So the frame is not absolutely square with straight sides all around, and that's a good thing. Because this processor has a little notch. Let me see if I can get it somewhere where you can see that notch. The notch is immediately below my fingernail right there in the little green circuit board. And there's one straight across from the processor, another notch. As a result, this land grid array will only fit one way into that socket. Now let's turn it over. It will drop right into that socket just like that. No pushing, no pressure. There is one notch with a little piece of plastic just at my fingernail. There's the other one. So this will only go in one way. Gently drop it in. Now you're ready to anchor it back into place. So what we've done effectively would also be what you would do if you wanted to upgrade this motherboard to a faster processor. That's a very realistic task that you might do out there. You might have a motherboard that has an existing processor that failed, or you want to replace it for a faster one. Taking off the heatsink and fan combination, then lifting out the old processor, setting it aside, putting the new processor in was what we just did. Let's lock it back down. The end needs to go underneath that screw. Once it starts under, then I can push down on the spring-loaded bar and lock it back up underneath, just like that. The final step we need to do is make sure we get new thermal compound. Don't ever assume that the old thermal compound is going to do it, especially if you change processors. Good chance that you're going to have places where heat does not transfer as efficiently as it should, might even do damage to that processor. Always scrape off the old gently with something plastic like a spoon, and then put on new thermal paste. But I'm not going to put it on the processor. I'm going to put it on the underside of the heat sink. So now we're going to pull back a little bit, and I'm going to lay my motherboard down, and I'm going to concentrate on the underside of the heat sink itself. Here is the underside of the heat sink. The fan, of course, is up in the palm of my hand. I've cleaned off all of that thermal compound there, and I'm now getting ready to put some more thermal compound on. Don't go cheap on the thermal compound. I'm not selling any particular brand name, but what I've got is something called Cooler Master High Performance Thermal Compound. Pay a little bit extra, get some good compound. The way that this particular compound comes is in sort of a little syringe. I'm going to pop off that little red cap, little plunger, so I can squirt some on. Now, currently, I'm holding this in a vertical fashion, so I am going to need to tilt it to about a 45-degree angle, and I want to show you how little is needed to efficiently transfer from the processor to the underside of this heat sink. Let's give it a shot. Sliding my motherboard out of the way for just a moment. Now, pardon me while I go down and rest the heat sink here on my anti-static mat. One of the things I did already was I took off the cap and I did a practice plunge with this plunger, because this is the second tube that I've purchased and it squirted all over, so you don't want to make a mess. Let's see what we can do. Don't go with the idea that if a little's good, a lot is better, because what you don't want is this stuff smearing all over the chip and then down onto the circuit board below. Not a good thing. Well, it's time to test it. This is for real. Let's see how well I have estimated the amount of thermal paste on the underside of this heat sink. I'm going to lift it up, bring my motherboard back over here. We're going to pull out just a little bit because I want you to get the big picture of where I'm going with this. I'm going to turn this guy over and, of course, put that copper circle right there in the middle of my processor and apply a little bit of pressure and see how it smears. I've got it down on. I'm going to apply moderately firm pressure there because it is going to be anchored down fairly tightly. You ready? All right, let's pull it off, see how much damage I've done. That's the underside of the heatsink, and you can still see just a little bit of the copper ring, and it did not get out onto the fins. And even better, I would like for you to zoom in on that because I'm kind of proud of that. Actually, I practiced a bunch before I got here. But the point is, it does not fall off the edge of the top of the chip down into the circuit, down onto the green part of the chip. It's not there. It stays up on top. Please make sure you do that. And if you don't, if it is a mess and you put too much, then for heaven's sakes, take a little bit of toilet paper, wipe it all off, start all over again and do it correctly. You want a good seal between the heat sink and the processor to transfer, but you don't want to make a mess. Combination of the two looks good. I'm going to go ahead and anchor my fan and heat sink assembly onto the motherboard on top of this processor. I'm going to hold with one hand the assembly because obviously I'm doing this up at an angle instead of flat on the desktop. And now I can lock each of the posts with a quarter turn in a counterclockwise fashion. That should have been one. I'm going to go to the opposite side. I did this one first. I'm going to go to the opposite side. If you've ever changed a tire, you know you don't do the one immediately next. You go straight across opposite to get it to... There we go. I think that's in. Let's try this one. I like that sound. I'm not sure that top one went in as good as it should because I didn't hear a good click. Let's try that one. I'm going to work on this one again. Now it wasn't down in the hole. Ah, there we go, there we go, there we go. Now the proof is in the pudding by turning it around. I'm going to turn around and look on the back side of this motherboard to make sure that all four of those combinations of that white plastic with the center black post is locking down this assembly. If you grab a hold of it and tug on it a little bit, it's actually pretty firmly on there. But a good visual inspection is not a bad idea. Let's see if we can get a look at that, and I'll turn it around. Yeah, we did all right. This one right here is fully extended with the black in between the two white. Black in between the two white. That one's looking good, and this one's looking good. Now I can have confidence that all four of those are going to keep that heatsink fan assembly fully anchored to the motherboard and resting firmly on top of my processor. Well, there's only one thing left to do. Let's go back around to the top of the motherboard. You don't ever want to forget this guy. Now, most all of the systems that you're going to run into, whether they're the new ones nowadays or some that are anywhere from 2 to 5 years old, they have heat sensors on the motherboard and on the processor so that if it gets too hot, it simply shuts down the system immediately. But I did talk to a student one time who made the mistake of forgetting to put this back as it needs to be, right there on its connector. He turned on the system, ran it for about 1.5 to 2 minutes, and he heard a loud crack. In that particular case, he had an older legacy motherboard that did not have a sensor to shut down the system when it got hot, and the fan wasn't spinning because he had no power. His processor literally cracked. Not a good thing. Okay. On the kit motherboard, we started with the system completely assembled as you see here. We manipulated these a little bit annoying but somewhat friendly plastic posts so that we could lift up the fan and heatsink assembly. We pretended that we were taking off this and putting in a new processor, which means we would scrape off the old thermal compound both on the underside of the fan and heatsink as well as on top of the processor. And then if we put in a new processor, it would be clean. We needed to apply the thermal compound to the underside of the heatsink. A little bit's good, don't put too much. And then I anchored back down my assembly on top of the processor and reattached power. That concludes our first of 4 demonstrations, and probably the most complicated of the bunch, for the CPU and cooling assembly mounted on top of the processor in the socket of this motherboard.